Welcome to Finding Hope, The End to Suffering. Hosted by psychologist, author, and co-founder of the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership, Dr. Barry Weinhold, with national radio host, award-winning producer, and inspirational speaker, Patricia Raskin.
Hi, everyone, and we are back with Finding Hope, The End to Suffering. I'm Patricia Raskin, co-host with Barry Weinhold, who is the creator and the founder and the aficionado of Ending Suffering and Finding Hope. And he's he's been doing this work for many decades, has a PhD in psychology. The list of what Barry has done is very long. Plus, he's written over 60 books. So, Barry, it was your idea to bring on people that could talk about really how do you find hope in going through and ending suffering, rather than just reading about it and having a session, but actually talking to people who've really moved through it. And now we're doing this through film. So, Barry, talk a little bit about that and how you brought George on. And I know he's going to talk about The Rear Window today.
Yeah, right. And I really enjoyed his analysis of Peter Pan. I learned some things I've seen several versions of Peter Pan, and it does have a lot of meaning for anyone who can identify with the characters. I mean, Peter Pan himself, Wendy, or Hook, or any of the characters in the movies are classical. People in real life are much like those people, and I've met Wendy's, I've met Peters, and I've met Hook. I mean, in real life, and so when I see him on the screen, pictured in cartoon style, I can still identify. Oh, that's just like so and so, or that's just like so. And also in terms of looking at it from a standpoint of finding hope and ending suffering, is you can see where Hook and even Wendy are in a dream world, and they're not going to end their suffering just because they don't seem to really get what's going on, and so it's a perfect example of a movie where the main theme is, if you don't address the issues in your life, it's going to not change, and you're going to continue to suffer.
Right. And so today we're going to talk about another movie, and George is going to explain.
And this one, of course, George will explain, but this is one of my favorite ones. So, George, you can talk about Rear Window.
I will.
George, can you do that? Tell us a little bit about your work again for people who are just tuning in.
I've been teaching film and English at Colorado College for many years, 40 years. I do narrative theory, how stories are constructed, how they work in both fiction and film. I've written 2 academic scholarly books about this with a long chapter on Peter Pan, if anybody is so long-suffering to look it up. By the way, I have to say one thing, Barry. Every time you meet a Wendy, in one sense, you do meet James Barry, because he invented the name Wendy for women. Just a comment. Anyway, we are so I teach a Hitchcock class. I love Hitchcock's films because of their depth and tremendous richness. And Rear Window, of course, 1954, is still very famous. And Jimmy Stewart, Grace Kelly. And one of the reasons I think it's so interesting is because it's a study of marriage. And, you've seen the movie. We have all the windows around the courtyard, each one of the different marriage story, or relationship story. And some of them end happily, some of them don't end happily. But the study of marriage is very complicated and ambiguous, and I think the movie ends with no resolution of the problems that it has identified between Jeff and Lisa. That's the Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly characters. At the very beginning, my first shot is a great shot of the nurse, Stella, who comes to talk to the reporter, photographer who's got a broken leg, Jeff. And they discuss marriage. And she says, well, don't do psychoanalysis, Barry, don't do psychoanalysis. Relationships should be just like 2 taxis crashing on Broadway. Well, we'll see how that works in the movie. And she also talks to him about what's wrong with him. He's watching all these people, including a very sexy young woman who does dances with her windows open across the way. And she says, you've been watching these women for weeks with your broken leg, and your temperature hasn't gone up an inch. Or do you have a hormone deficiency? And in fact, I think the film is partly about Jeff's real wound about women, his anger, his fear of women. And so when he and Lisa get together to talk about their futures, they don't have a future. He goes around the world taking photographs for Life magazine in Civil War zones and so on. He broke his leg taking a picture in the middle of the racetrack at Indianapolis. And she is a fashion model. She does sells $1,000 dresses on Park Avenue. And her idea is that he'll stop going to Africa to take photographs and do fashion photography of her clients in New York. And his idea is that she will go with him to Africa while he takes pictures. So they have two very different narratives. And what happens is this murder story intervenes. People get caught up in that, but there's no resolution at the end. The other thing I want to say about the murder, about the courtyard. So you know the movie, you know that the couple that's really involved, the Thorvalds across the way, are a couple that involve a woman who looks from a distance very much like Grace Kelly. She has blonde hair. She's pretty. She also whines a lot more than Grace Kelly does. But there's an idea that in a way the couple across the way are surrogates for Lisa and Jeff. And so that makes it very complicated when she's murdered. And there's a part of Jeff that perhaps wants that to happen. He dices up the women around the courtyard, Miss Torso, Miss Lonely Hearts. He has these names for the women that are kind of, in a way, chopping them up. So I think that the issue of marriage is crucial to the movie. And in the end, there is no resolution. So you'll see these two, the final shot of the movie is very famous, and people misread it all the time. Jeff has broken his other leg, saving her, fell out of the window. And so he's got two legs in cast. We have this long shot of Grace Kelly, Lisa, as she's on her couch looking at him. And on the first shot, if you'll bring it up, she's staring over her book at her sleeping boyfriend. And she's reading this book about Africa. And look at the look on her face. I don't know if you can see how well she's kind of looking to make sure he's not watching her. Okay? Look at that. Look, what do you think is that? Is that a look like? Is he going to see me? I mean, this is the last shot of the movie. Okay, now she puts down the Himalaya book, and the next shot is the final shot of the movie. She picks up her fashion magazine. Can you make that a little larger? Look at that smile on her face.
Yeah.
So is this a relationship built upon disguise, upon masquerade? She's pretending to be what Jeff wants. And people do that in relationships. They pretend what the other person wants them to be.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think of this, Barry? What's your analysis of this?
Well, that's what my description of codependency is that what happens is that in a marriage, typically, we hope that both people come in with enough of a self that they can act independently in the relationship, but frequently they can't. And so they develop a codependent relationship where the other one acts out parts of them that they haven't developed themselves. And so it's usually a trade-off. So if I act out this part of you that you don't want to deal with, then you have to act out some part of me that I don't want to deal with. And it becomes a mutual codependency that people then get stuck in. And usually what keeps it going is what I call projections, is that people project onto the other person what they want them to be and not who they really are. And so, I mean, people can live through 50 years of marriage and never really see the other person as they are. They see the other person through the eyes of their projections.
Yeah.
And I love that, Barry. And I think that's what Hitchcock shows us.
Yeah.
But people, wanted Lisa and they want Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart to get together. So they ignore parts of the movie. For example, she lives as a model. She creates herself. There's a moment in the movie when she introduces herself to him, going around the room, turning on the light. She says, Lisa, Carol, Fremont. And it's a question of whether she's ever more to him than a performance. And you notice at the end in that magazine, there's a woman on the cover of the magazine who has a red shirt on, a little bit like hers. And are they ever going to get out of the masquerade as performance for each other?
That's what codependency is. It's all a performance.
Yeah, I have a question about that for both of you, and Barry specifically. You hear about marriages where you hear this thing like the trophy wife, the trophy husband, and long-term marriages where they may not be happy, but that person looks good on their arm. So when they go out, look at this beauty I have. And that somehow can sustain a marriage I've seen it for many years. Comment on that. It seems like that's what George is talking about a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think the movie's aware of that and kind of nudges us to make us think about it. I think I commented before about mirror neurons work in different ways to different people. A lot of us talk about how stories in narrative theory have two audiences. There's the audience that sees, for example, a Disney movie. There's the adults who drove the kid to the movie in the old days anyway. People still will go back to movie theaters, I think. People drove the kid to the theater and then what the kid sees. Like there's an actual reference to Freud in the screenplay of Dumbo in 1941, the Disney movie. Well, not many 5-year-olds in 1941 knew Dumbo, knew Freud. So there's two tracks. Well, I think there's often two tracks in Hitchcock and a lot of great movies. There's the track for the audience that wanted things to end happily. And then there's a track for the audience that wonders about that smile of Lisa at the end and has noticed the performativity, can I use a fancy academic word, the performativity of the show. And I have my students, they just kill each other because they divide into camps. My students, they have very different ways of seeing the movie. And I love it when they argue with each other.
Yeah. Barry, what do you think about that? People who like glorify the spouse, even though they may not be happy or they may be lonely, but when they go out, it looks great. And so talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, the whole idea of projections and living out of one's projections is part of that, is that if I can project an image,
right,
then it keeps me in my comfort zone. And people will approach me, will be able to adore me and do everything that I want them to do, so it's all a matter of a performance.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. So George, where else do you want to take us with this in terms of what you want our audience to know about kind of, ending the suffering, if you will, finding the hope in relationships, because relationships are complex.
Right. Well, I think that second audience who notices the evasions of both Peter Pan and Rear Window, I think that audience is the audience that's going to see the road forward. The road forward is not to live in the world of performativity. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom here, and our next movie will show that. I was also supposed to talk about other movies in each of these categories. In the first category, I was going to talk about Beasts of the Southern Wild, movie that won a lot of awards in 2012. It was really very dark, and I think there's not a future. Another movie like this, Rear Window, is another Hitchcock movie, Shadow of a Doubt, which also has an ending that's very complicated and very double. But I think when the audience sees why some folks are blocked, and I think the movie diagnoses that, then I think you have the way forward. And I think our next movie, we're going to do Moonlight, is very clear about the suffering. There's very real suffering in Moonlight, as there is in Rear Window. But people become a little more honest about it. And none of us can ever be completely honest. But they're more honest, and they are working towards clarity. I don't think we see clarity. In fact, what I see at the end of Rear Window is only clarity for the audience that notices her smile as she picks up the book while he's asleep. That's the only clarity. But
do you think that movie was ahead of its time?
Absolutely.
It seems like it is, because the way you describe it, people didn't talk about that stuff then.
Well, some people did. But one of the things, that's one of the reasons Hitchcock is so big now. In fact, I do a lot of feminist film theory, and the filmmaker who is at the core of almost all feminist film theory is Hitchcock. What he did with gender roles and power games between the genders. And Hitchcock's very big. But I've actually heard an interview with John Michael Hayes, who wrote the screenplay for Rear Window, and he was very aware. His wife was a model. I mean, not every people at 54 could be pretty smart, but you're right. At the level of public discourse, this was really remarkable, and that's why these Hitchcock movies are going to live on forever. Because I teach them now. I teach Marnie. I was talking to Barry about this the other day, and kids come out of Marnie crying, because they suffer, they see the suffering. So it's right there, right now in their lives in 2000. I just taught it in 2021.
Yeah, it is. That's a great movie, a great example of that.
Yeah. I was telling Barry, I just finished the class, and a very smart graduating senior, so she's a little older, woman said at the end of the movie Marnie, there's some hope. She's kind of turning, but it's still very dark. And her comment she wrote to me on a paper said, I think the ending is hopeful, but Marnie has a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
That's Hitchcock.
Yeah,
I
right.
believe, and he saw that. Right, so the great artist Shakespeare. The great artists do see things, even about gender and power games between the sexes and so on.
George, before we go on to the next movie where you're going to introduce it, I've got this question. How do you think your students are affected after a class on these movies with you? How does it change their perception of life?
Well, I hope they have greater clarity about the way forward. I hope we talk a lot about these two audiences, and I think they look at how you evade, the way people evade the truth, I think, over a window. Actually, I don't know if it's appropriate to mention this, but the woman who's working on producing this series, Molly Seaman, took my Hitchcock class, and she talked about how it changed let her see relationships more deeply. It didn't teach her stuff she didn't know, but it clarified and deepened it, because she's very smart. But these are very contemporary movies, and I think they understand what is wrong about the way people think about gender and marriage, and they also see how you might fix it, though it's sometimes really hard.
All right, so share with us, because we're going to go next week. We're going to talk about the third movie, so explain that to us.
Moonlight. We're going to do Moonlight because it is some of you know, 2016 won the Oscar for Best Picture. It's an amazing movie to talk about very deep suffering. The main character is a young gay black man growing up in Miami in a world that's very deeply homophobic. His mother is a drug addict. He's very poor. Tremendous abandonment, tremendous abuse, and how he struggles with that. And the film was very honest about it in a beautiful performance by the cast. But at the end, he has a way of understanding himself that's quite beautiful. Into that movie, I'm always in tears, because I'll tell you, he finds love, which he has never found in his life. And he does it with some movement towards understanding himself.
I can't wait to hear that, Barry, for people who've had a lot of suffering and never had love and then find love later. It's got to be it's amazing for that.
Yeah.
So, Barry, any comments before we close?
No, I think this is a good place to close this episode, and we'll look forward to next week when we can talk about Moonlight.
All right, with George Butte. All right, everyone. I'm Patricia Raskin for Barry Weinhold, and George also will say goodbye, but don't go anywhere for next week, because we're going to talk about Moonlight.
This episode was brought to you by the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership. Find out more about these resources at weinholds.org. Dr. Weinhold is the author or co-author of 75 books on psychology, including his latest book, Get Real: The Hazards of Living Out of Your False Self, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. Patricia Raskin is the host of the nationally recognized program, The Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show, and is currently heard on voiceamerica.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. New episodes of Finding Hope: The End to Suffering can be found every Wednesday. If you like the show, please leave a review and give us a rating.